Hi, I'm Wendy Gardner and I'm going to show you how you can get the most out of this really lovely Makower Christmas stocking panel. Beautifully printed, there are 2 stockings on the panel plus motifs. So here's one I made earlier. Let me show you just how easy it is to make. And look, I've added a little rosette flower using some of those bits of fabric that are around the stocking. So the beautiful panel, as I said, is beautifully printed. You see, it even has a cutting line to cut out around the stocking and a seam allowance. So you cut on this line and sew on that line. Once you've cut it out, you can then use the stocking piece as your template to cut out the lining and the backing. So you need 1 back and 2 lining pieces. The next thing I've done with this is I have actually got some interfacing on the back to give it more body, and then stitching along some of the lines here just to hold that in place. So I've lined up my machine, so I'm going to stitch along the edge of this panel here, using that edge as a nice easy edge to follow. And I have increased my stitch length to 3 because I'm top stitching and I have wadding underneath. The next step is to add a hanging loop to the back. Now this is my back of the stocking, which I've done in a contrast fabric, and I've created a little loop out of about 10 centimetre of ribbon and stitched it across the top. I've set it in by the seam allowance, that's the side seam allowance, and it's on the sort of straight heel edge. Having done that, I can then put right sides together, my stocking front and my stocking back, and just pin them down the sides ready to sew. And note, as you look down the side, you've got the lovely seam allowance very clear and easy to see, so that it's easy to follow as you stitch. So with my 2 layers right sides together, I've just pinned my little loop out of the way so I don't catch it inadvertently. And then I'm going to place it under the presser foot so that the edge of the fabric is right on the edge of the foot. If I can always use the edge of the foot as a guide, I do. But in order to make sure I use the right seam allowance, I'm going to use the stitch width button to move the needle across. So just anchor the stitch to start, and then away we go. And now all I'm going to do is stitch all the way around the stocking, following that seam allowance as I go. Having stitched it all the way round, trim down the seam allowance, and then when you get to outer curves, cut little wedge shapes from the seam allowance. And this helps it lie nice and flat when you turn it through. So on inner curves you cut little slashes, and on outer curves little wedges. Now ready to turn the stocking through. Push out the heel and the toe and roll the seam so that the seam is right on the very edge, and then give it a good press with a hot iron. There's the stocking, beautifully pressed, and pressing really does make a difference. I'm now going to set it to one side because it's time to do the lining. Now I've used the stocking front as my template to cut the lining pieces. And I've stitched it in exactly the same way, but this time I've left a turning gap on one edge, on one of the straight edges, so that when I put the 2 stockings together and stitch around the top, I can turn them through here. I have also trimmed and wedged out of the heel and the toe and taken little diagonal slashes out of the inner curve. So that's all ready for me to slip the stocking inside. So I slip it inside so that the right sides are together. And the idea is that the toe goes into the toe, of course, and the heel into the heel. Not worrying too much about getting a perfect match, but because what I'm doing at the moment is actually putting the tops together. I'm going to sew on the inside of this circle because I want to still be able to see that seam allowance that's been so nicely provided. And of course I have the fabric edge on the edge of my presser foot too as another guide. Once you've stitched all the way around, you can just trim down the seam allowance, and then we're ready to turn it through that gap left in the lining. Having trimmed it, I'm now going to pull the stocking through that gap, and then once the stocking's through, I can also turn the lining through. Push out the boot and the toe, just like before. Roll it so that the seam is right on the very edge, and then give it a good press. And once it's all pressed, and don't forget to press the raw edges of the turning gap in, they then need to be stitched together. Now you can do that by hand, or you can do it quickly on the machine, that's entirely up to you. So I'm just going to give this a quick press and then stitch that turning gap closed. Now I'm just going to open up the stocking and push the lining inside. I'll push it all the way down, and now's the time to make sure the toe goes into the toe and the heel into the heel. So it takes a bit of wriggling. And then at the top, just going to yet again roll that seam. Now this time I want it very, very slightly rolled to the inside. So there's just a tiny, tiny little fraction of the outer fabric on the inside there. I'm going to top stitch around here using that line there as a guide, and that'll just make sure the lining stays inside. But I'm going to use the free arms. I'm taking off the flatbed extension and then just pop it under so I can do it in the round. I'm going to start near my hook, but I actually want to line up. Again, I'm going to use the edge of the presser foot, but I'm going to move the needle across as far as it will go. I just want to check. I want to be able to stitch on that line. That's perfect, but I'm going to just go back a little bit so I can start at the seam. Stitch on the spot to anchor, and then away I go. I'm also going to increase the stitch length to 3 because I've got layers here and I'm top stitching. Here it is, the finished panel. So quick and easy to sew. But let me show you what else I've done with the other motifs that were on that panel. Just like the stocking, I used the front panel as a template to cut a backing, and I made a little hanging ornament, a lavender bag, smells delicious, a little bit of lavender in there, a coaster, a label for a Christmas present, napkin ring, little bit of bunting, and a pocket for cutlery. Lots of ideas, they're my ideas, but I'm sure you'll have other ones. And don't forget, earlier on I mentioned the rosette. Now if you want to know how to make that, just click on the link below. So have fun with your Makower panel. Bye for now.